Hi. Okay, Kate Fry here. It's June 25th, 2020. It's the roughly third month of the quarantine, the coronavirus 19 quarantine. In the U.S., I'm in the Northeast U.S. Many states are beginning to loosen their quarantine, open up somewhat, and there's been a decline in the Northeast U.S., dramatic decline in cases, which is good. New York City was the original epicenter, and it's easing. There much less lower rate of transmission, lower death rate, but it's beginning to skyrocket in parts of the U.S., particularly southern states, which have opened up, massively skyrocketing, and it is disturbing. Also, this is the third or fourth week of mass protests in the wake of there were several horrific police murders. Context. In the U.S., the police kill at least 1,000 people every year. And the vast majority, 99% of them, no one is prosecuted. Only 1% people are prosecuted. There's some prosecution, and of those, something like only 30% are actually charged with anything, from what I understand. So this has been going on for a very long time, and there were three recent cases which were kind of the straws that broke the camel's back. And straw that broke the camel's back. There was the basically police murder of George Floyd by cop Derek Chauvin and others on May 25th in Minneapolis. Before that was the Breonna Taylor case in Louisville, Kentucky. Breonna Taylor was a young EMT, emergency medical technician. Cops, something like 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, broke into her apartment, a no-knock raid. It was apparently a drug bust. They got the wrong apartment. And interestingly, the people they were after had already been apprehended. Anyway, they got to the wrong apartment. Her boyfriend, understandably, thought someone was breaking in and shot the legs of one of the cops. And then the police again shot up Breonna Taylor, put 8 bullets in her and killed her. That was a horrific tragedy. Another one, there was the case of Ahmaud Arbery, who was a guy who was a runner, jogger. He was jogging in a town in South Georgia. Ended up in February of 2020, he was spotted and was chased by a group of basically white vigilantes. And one of them was a retired police detective. He was gunned down. And for like about a month afterwards, the police did absolutely nothing. They only through mass public pressure, they finally got people involved who were arrested and were charged with anything. Same as the case, the George Floyd case in Minneapolis. And these cases were kind of the tip of the iceberg. This happens literally all the time, over and over again. And so it triggered a wave of mass protest. Unbelievable. It hasn't happened in the U.S. in years. In Minneapolis, the police station, the precinct station, where the murderer of George Floyd, the officers who were involved in the police killing of George Floyd were stationed, was captured by protesters, burnt down. And in Seattle, protesters created an autonomous zone for whatever that's worth, group of anarchists. Similar things in the rest of the country, the mass protests. And this, in turn, unleashed a wave of extreme police brutality. There are at least 60 videos of savage police brutality, beating people, choking people, tear gassing people for no reason at all, totally innocent. It can be only described as a national police riot. And almost overnight, the whole legitimacy of the police as an institution was gone. They literally lost their legitimacy. Protests at some places almost reached an insurrectionary level. I wouldn't be accurate to say it was a revolutionary climate or pre-revolutionary situation, but maybe a pre-revolutionary situation. Protests are still going on, like 4 weeks later. They've dissipated somewhat, but it's filtered out to, initially it was 140 U.S. cities, then it was more. Then I'm hearing reports of dozens and dozens of small towns everywhere. The towns in Appalachia have protests. It's spread, and it's changed public consciousness. Minneapolis City Council has actually voted to abolish the police. Undoubtedly, they'll walk back from it or probably hire private security. But the fact is, it's astounding that they're even mentioning this. And so it goes into the role of policing in U.S. society, U.S. capitalism. The way U.S. capitalism has evolved on the oppression of black people, it's baked into the DNA of American capitalism. It is based on racial oppression. And this horrific police abuse over and over. There's so many cases, police escalating a situation, a minor situation, which police incredible brutality, killing people left and right. It's not an accident that happens. It's not a couple of bad cops. It's more than that. And it's a lot more than just bad policing. This is what the police are supposed to do. That's why they exist. Or urban police, one of their main functions, protect private property of wealthy people, and terrorize black people. Basically, it's one of their main purposes. And any struggle for the way ahead for a better society in the U.S. lies in fighting the police, beating back the police. I don't know what's going to happen, how it's going to play out. I think this represents a major change in consciousness in the U.S. And it was a very positive thing. Occupy was a change in consciousness in 2011, 2012. This ramps it up even more. And we'll see what happens. We're in the midst of a pandemic when U.S. society is kind of like a pressure cooker in some ways. There's about to be, economists are saying there's about to be a foreclosure crisis, an eviction crisis, a major economic collapse rivaling, perhaps worse than the Great Depression. And we'll see how things play out. Okay, anyway, my video today is on a book review, The Politics of Everybody, Feminism, Queer Theory, and Marxism at the Intersection by Holly Lewis. It was published by Zed Books in 2016. It's recently made, a couple of years after it came out, kind of started to make an impression around the left. I'm hearing more and more people talk about it. I read it a few months ago. I wrote a review for it, and now it's on my blog, and now I have a video version of it. Okay, so The Politics of Everybody, Feminism, Queer Theory, and Marxism, published in 2016, as a welcome addition to leftist debates on gender, women's oppression, the struggles of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans people, trans identities, and the orientation of the left towards sex workers. Holly Lewis is a former ISO member, and she was part of the reform slate when the ISO was in the process of collapsing, and I believe she teaches at the University of Texas. In effect, this book develops a queer Marxism. Now, a couple of years ago, I went to Left Forum in New York City, heard a guy named Alok Vaid-Menon, who was an activist, a performance artist, LGBT performance artist. He had a collective, which I can't figure out what they were called, but he gave a presentation, his group gave a presentation called The Transgender Tipping Point, which was interesting, and he made a reference to white people's Marxism. Initially, I was a bit surprised by this, taken aback, but I kind of understand what he means. Different communities use the tools of Marxism for their own liberation in different ways, and there are different languages, different directions people can go. But the tools of Marxism can be used, powerful tools to understand capitalist society, and tools for strategies for liberation. A book I read a couple of years ago, All That's Solid Melts into Air by Marshall Berman. He talked about, really great book. In the beginning, he talked about a demonstration he went to, and he saw a young woman who had a t-shirt with dancing Marxists, pictures of Karl Marx dancing in a circle. And he riffed on that, saying that, Marxism can be used by different communities for their own liberation. So, in light of that Marxism, Holly Lewis develops a queer Marxism, a Marxism for LGBT liberation, and kind of common language for different communities to talk. Lewis's book is an attempt to create a common language for LGBT struggles, feminist activism, and labor struggles rooted in a Marxist critique of capitalism. She introduces Marxist concepts and how they fit into queer politics, Not all at once, but in sections throughout the book. So she introduces Marxism, not right away, but throughout the book. And by the way, this is was a difficult book to review. There's a lot in it. There's a lot in it where I'm going to try to tease out the main strands of her thought and use it may have. So Holly Lewis opens with a discussion of the ambiguities of the concept of community. She talks about community. Who is everyone, which liberals and conservatives claim to speak of. Like, we have a democracy where everybody has a voice, everyone is included. Like, who is included in our community and who is not in various concepts of community. And she goes into critique identity politics and offers a revolutionary Marxist view of LGBT liberation. And she reviews philosophies of Foucault, Derrida, Lacan, and many other theorists who had some influence on the academic left, and the activist left as well. So in the introduction, she starts off with everybody. Who is everybody? Like, I had a Facebook debate a few months ago during the height of the Sanders campaign. People were talking about democratic socialism and debate, like, what is socialism? And I said that, Bernie Sanders is not a socialist. He's a reformist. He says some good things. He's a New Deal reformist. But like FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, was not a socialist. Government programs are not socialist in and of themselves. The New Deal is not socialist. The military, the police are not socialist. There are people who are saying they are. So I disagreed. There was a debate. Someone in this debate said, well, I said that, Sanders, the socialism, like, what is democratic socialism? The slogan they were using, it's so amorphous. What does it mean? There's a whole socialist tradition, the first four internationals, whole tradition. And one person said, well, socialism is whatever the people decide it means. Well, okay, what are the people? They include the police, they include the This is also similar to what Jodi Dean talked about in her book, Comrades. She discussed the ambiguities of the term the people. Okay, so the second chapter of Holly Lewis's book, she goes into a history of Marxist feminism and critiques various Marxist feminists. And the third chapter, she discusses the ideology around queer theory, questions popular approaches to queer anti-capitalism, and she gives a different understanding that each of these movements have a different queer theory, Marxism, feminism, have a different understandings of what's meant by system. Marxist, queer activists, and feminists, particularly second-wave feminists, whose feminism is not linked to queer politics, tend to talk past one another in their critiques of identity politics. While Marxists do not entirely negate the value of situated knowledge, queer theorists are often ambivalent or unclear about objectivity, and I'll elaborate on this. In the third chapter, she discusses from queer nationalism to queer Marxism. So throughout the book, Holly Lewis reviews Marx's project of a critique of political economy. Basically, capitalism works systematically. It's not, the bad things about capitalism are not a result of a conspiracy by plutocrats. It's not a broken system. It functions in accordance with its own laws, like laws of motion, Marx called it, of capital. There are innate contradictions which are played out within capitalism. Boom and bust cycles are inherent to the system. You can't have capitalism without it. For example, workers, people who have no capital and must rent out their labor power to survive, and the bourgeois, owners of capital. And these two classes, social classes, are basically create one another and reinforce one another, and there are a zillion inherent contradictions playing out. In my earlier videos, I tried to describe this somewhat. And the productive, under capitalism, the productive capability of humanity is subordinate to the need of a few people at the top to make a profit out of our labor. Capitalism is based on constant growth. It poses a threat to the global ecosystem. Crises are a feature of capitalism, but we shouldn't suggest that the system is necessarily collapsing or coming to an end. It won't come to an end unless we make it come to an end, and suggest that the system should be replaced. So that's, in a nutshell, the Marxist critique of capitalism. And she gives an overview of the origins of capitalism, some of the basics of Marxist economics, materialism, and material conditions. So, as I mentioned, it's based on class struggle, essentially. Anti-capitalist struggle cannot be limited to proclamations of equality or commitments to emancipatory politics, as she says. I'm quoting from her book. It actually has to understand its capitalist present in order to plan a path towards an anti-capitalist future. Her book suggests a bold new approach, as she says, the old unfashionable approach of Marxist materialism, complete with the even more unfashionable call to reinvest in the centrality of working class organizing to begin a revolutionary transformation of social relations. So she reviews the development of post-structuralist philosophies, which have been popular with the academic left, and critiques of Marxism, structuralism, and so on. Okay, so she discusses Derrida, a long critique of Derrida, and she sees this philosophy as blocking communication between oppressed groups, seeing knowledge as essentially purely situational, the idea that there's no unequivocal language, which is deeply, for different groups and different struggles, for something which is deeply problematical for Marxists. And then she gives a deconstructionist critique of Eurocentric knowledge, essentially an attack on Marxism. And then she gives an overview of Marxism's relationship to gender, how gender has evolved, and a critique of different feminisms, different types of feminism from a Marxist perspective, and so on. And okay, so she talks about early Marxist and socialist feminism, complex arguments. Basically discusses Marx's own gender politics. He analyzed women's rights in relationship to property rights and the development of the family structure throughout history. The first Marxist feminist was August Bebel, who wrote Women and Socialism. He essentially neglected the class basis of women's oppression. Later, much more famous Marxist feminist was Clara Zetkin, very famous German socialist leader. She offered a class analysis of the oppression of working class women, which is oppression was rooted in class. She talked about working class women are servants to wealthy women. Essentially, though, she saw women's oppression as rooted under capitalism, but she saw liberation as women being free to lead fulfilling lives as wives and mothers, like traditional roles, after all. So Clara Zetkin romanticized the peasant family and the division of labor within it, which Holly Lewis says leaves us with the strange legacy of having created class analysis of women's oppression by attempting to build an oppositional sexism for working class women. So she wanted women to be free to have traditional roles. So irony. Lewis discusses the relationship of Marxism to second-wave feminism and debates around queer theory. So she's speaking within the LGBT community. She discusses queer theory, which is a theoretical approach to LGBT oppression and activism, which, like post-colonial theory, developed out of the post-structuralist milieu in a period when Marxism declined in popularity, both within academia and activist circles. She traces the development of postmodernist philosophies and their influence on left activist milieus as working class struggles rolled back in the 1970s and 1980s. So she provides a very detailed discussion of developments in left-oriented academic philosophy, much of which, interestingly, came out of debates within Marxism, but moved far from a Marxist materialist outlook and a Marxist analysis of oppression. I mentioned she mentions Jean-Paul Sartre, who Sartre was an existentialist philosopher. He was also a Marxist, or came to Marxism and attempted a fusion of Marxism and existentialism, and there's some big critiques of it, of his approach they seemingly opposite philosophies in some ways. So various philosophers critiqued Sartre's attempt to combine Marxism and existentialism, and some of these thinkers themselves started within a Marxist framework, but then moved pretty far out of it. And there are other critiques. So many of these French thinkers, existentialists, postmodernists, post-structuralists, were originally Marxist. Some of them were originally in the French Communist Party. They moved far out of it. They're on the left, but they kind of moved far out of it. So Lewis critiques French post-structuralist leftist thinkers such as Jacques Derrida, Jean-Paul Lyotard, and explains how their deconstruction of texts and grand narratives ultimately subverts all meaning, including the meaning of projects for social change. She especially critiques Lyotard, who attacked Marx's idea of social progress in terms of gender politics as thinking, with its focus on subjective, localized experiences, denies the possibility of solidarities across borders and between women in different struggles around the world. So Lewis feels this thinking, which became popular as working class movements were pushed back in the 1980s, and neoliberalism became entrenched as the ruling class ideology. Leftists lost faith in the working class as an agent of historic change, had a very corrosive influence on the left. So postmodernism became popular just as working class movements were pushed back and people lost faith in the working class as an agent of change. So identity politics, what we call identity politics today, has radical origins in some ways. Now it's basically bean counting, and people happy about Hillary Clinton being the first woman president, first, people being drone bombed her, so probably happy that a woman president is drone bombing them. The CEO is a woman CEO of Yahoo a few years ago. The first thing she did was anti-policies which are hurtful, such as women employees, banning work from home, and so on. The Democratic Party, of course, is really big on identity politics. Now that's basically all they have to offer. And of course, it's not bad. I mean, Obama was a horrible president, but it's significant that there was a black president, and it's important to include more people in, but a single-minded, simplistic reliance on that. You read some mainstream newspapers about this, man, it's just so weird. It's so weird. Lewis discusses Michel Foucault, very influential thinker, and he played a big role in the development of modern queer theory. Foucault also rejected grand historical narratives, but focused on systems of power, which he saw as inherent in organizations and social systems. I read, towards the end of his life, he wrote a 3-volume set, The History of Sex, which is really interesting. I haven't read the whole thing. I've read parts of it. I bought it at a Goodwill store years ago. I still have it. I want to get back to it. And he sees like history of society's attempts to control sexuality as being embedded in these competing narratives and dialogues, and which is hiding systems of power and people being, their natural drives being subverted and warped by this. And it's interesting. I think he does have something to say. But Foucault and many other thinkers took some of these ideas way too far, devoid of any connection with material reality. So Lewis and the philosophers have been hugely influential since the 1980s, especially on the left, on the academic left. And Lewis contrasts these postmodernist philosophies with Marxism, which is grounded not in identity or narrative, but in position, one's relationship to the means of production. The working class, which Marx saw as the most important agent of historical change under capitalism, are those people without access to the means of production, who there must rent out their ability to work, as I mentioned, their labor power to survive. Now, Lewis also talks about the theory of false consciousness stemming from this feminist theory. Western feminist theory is big on idea of false consciousness, that women, major element of patriarchal oppression of women is women being made to conform to patriarchal ideas of beauty and how women should act. And the answer lies in individual breaking free from that, breaking out of false consciousness. She contrasts this with feminist thinking in developing world, in the third world, where they don't even think about this. The idea is liberating women from oppressive social structures. So Lewis explains Western feminist thought focuses more on distortions of self-perceptions and false consciousness due to living under patriarchy, and differs from third world feminists who are more interested in collective action. And so she also differentiates queer theory from Marxism. Queer theory, as it's developed, asserts that identity as a conceptual category serves as a disciplinary apparatus that pigeonholes the fluidity of the self into a politically docile normativity. That's a lot of $5 words there. What it basically means is that identity politics, according to queer theory, pigeonholes people into specific identities as a means of control when our identities are always much more fluid and not static, so it's using identity politics as a means of social control. So queer theory does have a critique of liberal identity politics. So she goes on to say, this places the queer subject in a privileged epistemological position. Those who experience no gender dissonance vis-a-vis the systemic ignorance of its forces and contours. What she's saying is that people say trans people, for example, are more understanding of or fully confronted with this means of social control inherent in identity politics, while so-called straight cisgender people aren't. And queer subjects are diverse, but share a collective understanding that forms a basis for political cohesion. For queer theory, the term identity politics is derogatory because it assumes that identities are clear-cut groupings with clear definitions are desirable. So it pigeonholes and forces people into categories. It's a critique of queer theory does have an interesting critique of LGBT struggles, of the LGBT movement, which there's some truth to it. But Lewis's critique of queer theory, she calls it an anti-identity politics. So the Marxist critique of many non-Marxist feminists and queer theory is that if you want to analyze inequality as systemic, it's necessary to transcend the individual mind. If knowledge is contained within a standpoint rather than capable of being inflected by a standpoint, then systemic knowledge is not possible, and as a consequence, inequality cannot be forged systematically. Lewis then, so she sees the need for a common ground of struggle. If one society is everyone is fluid and made up of a myriad of individual standpoints, where's the ground for common struggle? So Lewis discusses the Marxist view of the development of the family, patriarchy, and homophobia that's rooted in the materialist analysis of Friedrich Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Now, if you haven't read this, you really should. It's a masterpiece. It's the foundation of Marxist anthropology. It was written over 100 years ago in the 1880s, I believe. But it stood the test of time. I believe, like what I've researched, 80% of it is still pretty much, he got some things wrong, but 80% of it is still accurate. Now, okay, Friedrich Engels wrote this after Marx died from notes that Marx left. Towards the end of his life, Marx became interested in non-Western cultures, indigenous societies, and so on. He took notes. A lot of this is based on the American anthropologist of the time, Henry Louis Morgan, and Morgan was adopted by the Iroquois, traveled around the world, studied the Polynesian culture of Hawaii and indigenous societies around the world, tribal societies, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Slavic cultures, and so on. And Morgan was a materialist. That is, societies are determined by their material level or influenced by the material level. So, for example, the vast majority of human society, the human race, Homo sapiens, were about 300,000 years old, as far as I know. And the overwhelming majority of this, like at least 95% of it, was egalitarian. We're hunter-gatherers. We were in, essentially, it was what Marx called, or Engels called, primitive communism. People shared the stuff they had to. Then there was a very gradual stratification. The development of agriculture, certain groups had property, and as property accumulated, people had to organize themselves to protect their property. and developed a class stratification. And Morgan and Marx and Engels said you could see how this developed different societies at different levels of development. The Iroquois, for example, were at one level. Hawaiian tribal culture, Polynesian culture was another level. Ancient Greece and Rome were at another level. And you can see the state developed. Basically, there was a shift in gender relations. Earlier, it was egalitarian, became patriarchal, mainly because families crystallized as groups to protect the property that had accumulated within a tribe. They had a need to pass property down to their descendants. Therefore, a man had to know who his descendants were. Women were more controlled in the development of patriarchy. That's what it came out of. And he traces this very detailed fashion. Some of Engels was wrong. He did get some things wrong, but the majority of it he got right, and I think it's a masterpiece. I recommend everyone read it. Bourgeois anthropology, mainstream anthropology has gone in different directions. As far as I know, it doesn't outrightly disagree with Engels, but just kind of ignores it. There's schools of anthropology, what I know of structuralism, which has some insights. It follows symbolism. There's Claude Levi-Strauss and so on, functionalism, etc. Anyway, Engels sort of ignores this insights because Marxism is like the skeleton, and materialist analysis is like a skeleton in the closet. Societies evolve rooted in material conditions, and Lewis says, Holly Lewis says, this has important insights for feminism. So then she gives an overview of the beginning of the modern LGBT movement in the 1960s and 70s, which were originally rooted in anti-capitalist revolutionary politics. There's Stonewall, the Gay Liberation Front, the attempted alliance with the Black Panthers, etc. And early 1960s, early LGBT, the late 60s, early 70s LGBT movement was explicitly revolutionary, but by the 90s it morphed into the corporate pride parades of today, where like TD Bank or Bank of America has floats, and it was just a giant upscale marketing scheme, and police are marching in pride parades. This is a rebellion against this, but so describes how 1980s, Reagan broke the Patco air traffic controller strike in 1981, the British coal miners strike in 1984, the onset of neoliberalism. It describes the shock doctrine of Naomi Klein, and this activism, like Marxist activism, revolutionary politics, was pushed back, and the LGBT movement had kind of a revival in the 80s, but it was corporatized, highly corporatized. Okay, so social reproduction theory. Holly Lewis spends a long time talking about this, and after discussing the philosophical backgrounds of contemporary feminism and queer theory, Lewis discusses debates around feminism and gender. So she introduces the work of the Marxist feminist Lisa Vogel. So Lisa Vogel is kind of the founder, the mother of modern Marxist feminism. There were other Marxist socialist feminists, but she was the mother of the modern version. Beginning in the 1980s, Lisa Vogel opened up a discussion within Marxism of social reproduction and the contrary and complex nature of women's oppression under capitalism. Vogel and others cite blind spots in traditional Marxist-influenced feminism, such as understanding the role of ideology and psychological factors. So, right. Lewis describes early Marxist feminists, such as Clara Zetkin and August Bebel, I've talked about them before, as favoring a conservative, traditional role for women in a post-capitalist society. So Vogel herself has an interesting background. She's a feminist and civil rights activist, art historian. She comes from an art historian background. She came from a leftist family. Her father fought in the Spanish Civil War. She's a contributing founder to what's known as modern social reproduction theory, along with Tithi Bhattacharya. Her famous book is Marxism and the Oppression of Women, and Vogel dealt with blind spots in the traditional Marxist view with a dual system approach. Now, let me explain this. Marxist dual system approach to the oppression of women or the women's liberation, was women's struggles. This understands women's oppression as, quote, deriving from their situation with an autonomous system of sex divisions of labor and male supremacy. Basically, class struggle and gender struggle are two separate structures. Women's oppression and class suppression are viewed as independent, and there is the implicit idea that the two motors drive the development of history, class struggle and sex struggle. This dual character can be seen, for example, in the preface to the opening of Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Now, Engels says that production and reproduction of immediate life is of a twofold character. On the one hand, the production of the means of existence, clothing and shelter, and the tools necessary for that production. And on the other hand, the production of human beings themselves, the propagation of the species. The social organization under which the people of a particular historical epoch and a particular country live in is determined by both kinds of production, by the stage of development of labor on one hand and of the family on the other. So, in a nutshell, Engels, his book was a masterpiece, Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, but he got a few things wrong. And in the opening, basically, here he's saying that the economic struggle is essentially really to a society makes their living from the material, based on the material conditions available, is one thing, and it's separate from the sex struggle, the oppression of women in the family. He sees them as basically separate struggles, and this has been the traditional Marxist view. So Vogel, Lisa Vogel, and which Holly Lewis spends a long time talking about. Vogel argues that the social reproduction perspective comes from Marx's Capital, very famous work, and is an idea that women's suppression has its roots in women's differential location within social reproduction as a whole. Basically, this means that class struggle would be the central dynamic of social development, and the major characteristics of a class society would still be the appropriation of surplus labor by the dominant class. Like all class societies have a group at the top which siphons up the surplus production. And this happened all throughout history in class society. This appropriation, though, would require the constant renewal of the working class, including generational replacement, in which women play a vital role. So she's integrating the two types of dynamics, the two roots of oppression, economic oppression and the reproduction of the working class. She develops how they're intrinsically linked and combined together. Social reproduction theory admits that Marxism's and Marxist treatment of women, both theoretically and practically, has not always been great. Like if you read the history of the German SPD, they were their main socialist party in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. They were in theory really big on women's liberation, but you look at pictures of them, they're based on male industrial workers, and their meetings and congresses were all these guys with huge beards, epic beards, one or two women, but not very many. And they were theoretical. They said, women's oppression will be solved, but we can't deal with that now. It's subsumed into the struggle against capitalism. We have to overthrow capitalism, and then everything's okay. We can't. And there's some pushback. Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, and so on. Some women feminists did have a pushback against this, but even their pushback wasn't all that great either. So, Lisa Vogel refers to Marx's Capital, and she says, scholars argue that the key to the system, our labor power, is actually self-produced and reproduced outside of capitalist. Holly Lewis argues that the key to the system, our labor power, is self-produced and reproduced outside of capitalist production in what she calls a kin-based site called the family. Really good passage she has, explains the connection between class struggle and women's suppression. She says, class struggle over conditions of production represent the central dynamics of social development in societies characterized by exploitation. In these societies, surplus labor is appropriated by the dominant class, and an essential condition for reproduction is the renewal of a subordinated class by direct producers committed to the labor process. Ordinarily, generational replacement provides most of the new workers need to replenish this class, and women's capacity to bear children therefore plays a critical role in class society. That explains anti-abortion crusades and so on, and the war against women that went on in the early 2000s by some right-wing politicians in the U.S. In property classes, women's oppression flows from their role in the maintenance and inheritance of property. In subordinate classes, people who don't have property, working class people, female oppression derives from women's involvement in processes that renew direct producers, as well as their involvement in production. That's a quote from Lisa Vogel's Marxism and the Oppression of Women. So essentially, the main argument Vogel and later Marxists call social reproduction theory shows how the production of goods and services and the production of life are part of one integrated process. If the formal economy is the production site for goods and services, the people who produce such things are themselves produced outside of the formal economy at very little cost for capital. So, huge amount of women provide a huge amount of unpaid labor. These activities, which form the very basis of capitalism in that they reproduce the worker, are done completely free of charge for the system by women and men within the household and the community. In the United States, women still carry a disproportionate share of this domestic labor. And according to a 2012 survey, U.S. women put in 25.9 hours a week of unpaid domestic labor in 2010. Men put on 16.8 hours a week, at a difference of more than 9 hours. Survey includes indexable tasks such as childcare, cooking, shopping, housework, odd jobs, gardening, and others. So there's a debate. Holly Lewis talks about the debate around Marx's advocacy of what was known as the family wage in the 19th century, and was Marx himself sexist or patriarchal. And so basically, we have to understand the development of the nuclear family we have today was kind of a result of 19th century class struggle in the U.S., England, and the rest of the developed world during the late 19th century. Class struggle resulted, the nuclear family became the standard form for the social reproduction of the working class. On one hand, Holly Lewis says, worker struggles result in a larger family wage in which some adult males, as quote, heads of the household, could afford to keep their whole family. So basically, the family wage was the male was considered the breadwinner, and women were subordinate workers. Marx was in favor of an increase in the family wage and making that a worker's demand. That kind of reified the nuclear family itself. So Holly Lewis discusses that, feels Marx wasn't sexist in the context of the time. It was the correct thing to increase the family wage. So adult males could afford to keep their whole family, but on the other hand, the ruling class also succeeded in imposing Victorian morality and the acceptance of women's natural role being in the home, working to reproduce current and the future generations of labor power. So it's sort of a complex analysis of how the nuclear family and traditional gender roles evolved. And Holly Lewis analyzes this. She has a really great passage. She says, economics is the origin of the normativity in heteronormativity, not intolerance of difference or the other, not a pure desire for power or an abstract need to control, not a lack of sexual creativity or dullness, or not a Eurocentric racial spirit. It is the fact that the generational replacement of the labor force requires sexually active people with certain body parts to go through extended periods of non-activity. The capitalist class benefits from this generational replacement, but it does not want to make any concessions to the people who make it happen. Social gender and the management of sexuality under capitalism are shaped according to the struggle over who pays for what is necessary to socially reproduce the working class. So the roots of homophobia or roots of heteronormativity, there's one way to live, one way to have sex, ultimately go to the development of the family, of the nuclear family, the need for reproduction of the working class, the next generation of workers. And there's some really complex analysis around this. So the identification of the social reproduction of the working class as the root of women's oppression under capitalism has become increasingly accepted. Like most, as far as I know, most socialist organizations kind of agree with this now. It was more controversial years ago. Social reproduction is beginning to develop a coherent and compelling framework for analyzing developments as far apart as the increase in violence against women in the global north and the outsourcing of reproduction to the army of disposable workers, to the double or triple burdens on women workers in countries such as India and China. So she has an interesting discussion on various critiques of identity politics from queer theory activists and second-wave feminists. She looks for common ground between these approaches. Feminists and queer activists agree on fighting at a systemic level. They disagree with the meaning of system and the political role of individuals within the system. Marxist activists, on the other hand, see the system as directly stemming from material conditions rather than narratives or senses of the self. So, Lewis, working from a solidly Marxist framework, develops a Marxist analysis of queer struggles. She discusses the same-sex marriage debate and argues for a tolerant understanding rooted in materialism of different perspectives. Like, for example, she says that working families do not exist to pass property on to offspring, rather they exist to pool resources for survival. During the debate on marriage equality, left opponents of marriage equality who often dismissed it as an attempt to conform to bourgeois family norms, or often queers in cosmopolitan cities where few but the super wealthy own property. Well, ironically, the small town queers, due to constraints of poverty, have an interest in passing on cars and other property material, the material needs for marriage, and not due to material needs, not conforming to heteropatriarchal norms. So I remember that. I lived in the Boston area during the Goodrich decision. There were huge protests for same-sex marriage and marriage equality, and I generally supported this, but I wasn't really super enthusiastic about it. Said, some radical friends of mine critiqued, fitting into patriarchal, heterosexual norms, like, why do you have to, what's the big deal about getting married if a couple wants to have a relationship? Why don't they have their own ceremony? What's the big deal on legal? But, LGBT people in the countryside had a somewhat different viewpoint. There was material reasons for being in favor of LGBT marriage. Like cities, people didn't have a lot of property to inherit. They didn't really care too much. But in more rural areas, they did, and it really meant something. It was there were legal protections, and I can understand it. Holly Lewis talked about the need for a dialogue between people in different situations, different sides of this. Okay, so Lewis critiques or dialogues with what's known as the vector theory of oppression of left neoliberalism, which he calls left neoliberalism, in favor of a solidarity based on shared material conditions. The vector theory of oppression came out of intersectionality theory, and she does a discussion on this. There was a group known as the Combahee River Collective, a group of black lesbian activists in the Boston area in the early 1970s, late 1960s, early 70s, and other thinkers later on. Basically, vector theory is the idea that oppression comes from different directions. There are interlocking sets of power relations in a society, and it's different from standard white feminism. It's the patriarchy, or it's men. This vector theory is a bit more complex, and it's very popular among leftist activists. Some version of this is extremely influential and popular. Holly Lewis describes how there's various theories of intersectionality. It shouldn't be dismissed. It's very popular and has some truth to it, but minus a class analysis can be quickly weaponized and appropriated by neoliberalism. It wasn't the original idea of this. It originally came out of a radical perspective. So Holly Lewis says that various Marxist feminists, including Sharon Smith, who I believe was also in the ISO, haven't adequately understood and answered to intersectionality theory. There are flaws. She says each vector of oppression can't be seen as separate from economic exploitation. That has to be the root of it. And Holly Lewis wants us to replace the vector model of oppression with a unitary relational model. She offers a class-based critique, and I'm getting a lot of this section from MR Monthly Review online review. I'll post a link to it, my channel here. A really good MR online review of this attacking or critiquing a vector theory of oppression intersectionality from like a Marxist perspective is often counterposing class struggles, often ridiculed by workerism, by an attempt by cisgender heterosexual men to evade responsibility for the inequalities which they perpetuate and in maintenance of their own privilege. And you have some truth to this. But Holly Lewis goes on to say that class isn't more important than other forms of oppression, but it, in effect, sets the overall rules of the game. These other oppressions and roots of oppression are rooted in overall class dynamics, and she argues for a unitarian class analysis of this. So she thinks that's what Marxism, a Marxist analysis can offer. So again, really good review of the book in MR online. So Holly Lewis discusses the gay washing by institutions such as the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and the weaponization of LGBT rights in the service of U.S. imperialism. Contrast this with a queer Marxist analysis of post-colonial theory. So you hear a lot about how Israel is more gay-friendly or LGBT-friendly than surrounding Arab countries. Supposedly the IDF is slightly more gay-friendly, and Tel Aviv is a gay neighborhood. Israel itself is a very homophobic country, for one thing. And she says you can't weaponize it. The root is not supporting the oppression of the Palestinians, understanding how all these oppressions are linked under class oppression. So she critiques the weaponization of LGBT rights in the service of U.S. imperialism and contrasts this with the queer Marxist critique of post-colonial theory. By updating Marxism as applied to queer communities, she shows the needs for solidarities between oppressed communities not recognized by the postmodernism of recent decades. And she discusses queer solidarity with the Palestinian liberation struggle, debates around queer imperialism, the U.S. Army's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which is disastrous, and its effects on the anti-war movement. How leftists should, or LGBT leftists should orient towards Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and so on. She ends with a critique of homo-nationalism, the weaponization of LGBT rights in the service of imperialism, discusses solidarity movements between LGBT activists and the U.S. and the Palestinian struggle. In an earlier video, I interviewed Pauline Park, who's an LGBT activist who went to Palestine, was part of a solidarity movement with the Palestinian people. So overall, Lewis develops the case for the development of a queer Marxism, which would fill in the missing links for resistance and solidarity in prevailing postmodernist left philosophies and approaches. The politics of every day is an important addition to socialist theory in the 21st century. And solidarity among a large subset of people is bound to be fluid, internally shifting, based on a collective political anti-capitalist solidarity. It implies interrupting the expropriation of surplus value with the end product of system change. It requires a principle of minimum connection between political actors. Minimal connection simply means grounds for, I'm quoting from Holly Lewis here, minimal connection simply means the grounds for solidarity are possible. She goes on to say that pointless suffering might actually be grounds for such a commonality, which a lot takes place under capitalism. She says that this type of universalism is actually contentious. Universalism is often castigate as swimming in European male dominance, but all gestures towards common human feeling are not alike. And she contrasts the universalism of market forces and the streamlining of human life into a conduit for the enrichment of a few at the expense of the many, universalism from above, with the alternative, a universalism from below. Not a toothless humanism, but a militant commitment to inclusion that doesn't deny antagonism. And she opens up a fascinating discussion of how universalism from below of oppressed people can connect with sexual and gender differences throughout history and in different cultures. And then she talks about third or fourth gender roles in different cultures and how historically cultures have have incorporated LGBT identities in different ways. And finally, Holly Lewis says, I write this in the hope of bringing four groups into dialogue. Marxist theorists who are trying to understand where gender fits into the schema of Marxist practice, feminist theorists who wish to incorporate Marxist analysis into their work, Marxist practitioners unfamiliar with the politics and origins of third-wave feminist, queer, and trans politics, and finally, queer and trans feminist activists unfamiliar with the Marxist political economy. And of course, there's some overlap, including people such as myself. And she hopes to bring these groups into dialogue. So I recommend reading it. Great book. I hope my review was interesting and of some use. If you enjoy my work, please subscribe, like, and share. Thank you very much.